Oh, okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Apart from the mention of the other Mark Almond. But no, thank you very much. And thank you for plugging the books, of course. And there'll be kind of a link to the books at the end of the talk, if you're interested. But thank you very much, everybody, for coming to this talk. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to reach out to people from all around the world, and so many teachers, practitioners, and clearly people who come to a talk like this on a Friday afternoon must be highly motivated and passionate about their profession, and have that inherent desire to develop as practicing teachers. So welcome, everybody. I hope obviously you find this useful. As Alan said, I'm going to divide the talk into two parts. So the first part will be mainly theoretical, and we're going to sort of define some of the terms that are relevant to drama in education. And then the second half of the talk will be looking at some practical ideas that hopefully you'll feel enthused to use with your own students in your classroom, wherever you may be. So as you can see from my first slide, the title of the talk is Teaching English Through Drama to Develop Our Learners' Spoken Communication Skills and Listening Skills. Speaking and listening in language teaching are often separated, which I don't think is particularly useful, because with face-to-face interaction and of course interaction online, we both speak and listen simultaneously. So I think it's probably more useful to put these two skills together and perhaps refer to them as spoken communication skills, including listening. So that's one thing we're going to look at. Also going to think about aspects of non-verbal communication, and empathy as well, and how we can develop our students' empathic skills. The next point, self-confidence, incredibly important. A lot of our students might actually have a lot of passive knowledge, and what we want to do as teachers is we're teaching a language, we're teaching a life skill. So what we want is our students to have the confidence to be able to communicate as spontaneously as possible with confidence. And then the last point there is developing our students' general expressiveness through voice and body. So what I've tried to do is to try and link in with the general theme of the other webinars. Is what I've tried to do is tried not to just give you a talk about drama in language education, but rather look at how drama can develop these human skills, these social skills, these emotional skills, empathic skills, etc., in order, first of all, to develop our students' self-confidence and to create a kind of a harmonious community inside the classroom, but also looking at how these skills can be transferred to the outside world whenever our students may find themselves in situations when they need to communicate in English, or indeed, actually, I mean, a lot of the skills I'm going to talk about can easily just as easily be appropriated to L1 use, So hopefully it will cover those areas sufficiently. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Right. Okay. So this is a quote which I love to use, and I'm aware that many speakers draw on this quote from Earl Stevick. It's a quote from one of his books. He sadly passed away a few years ago, but a great pioneer in humanism in language education. And I'll just give you 10 seconds to read the quote. So hopefully it's clear that what Earl is talking about there is the importance of social skills inside the classroom. And these are skills. I mean, he wrote this in 1980, a long time ago. I'd like to say before I was born, but it actually isn't before I was born. But this principle still applies today, I think, and I'll give you a little bit of background about what I do just in a moment. But generally speaking, I do a lot of teacher training in my work here in the UK. And I'm an external assessor for certain teacher training courses. And I know that these kinds of social skills that I'm going to be talking about this afternoon are still quite neglected on English language teaching or teacher training syllabuses. So it's still an area that is quite often neglected, and it's really important, as Stevik says, to focus more on what goes on between the people inside the classroom. So that for me is a very clear a key quote. So carrying on with this general theme. So defining our terms. So first of all, the word drama. The etymology of drama, as you can see, originally comes from Greek, and it came through Latin, and it basically means to play, to act, or simply to do. And so in terms of language teaching, the simple principle is that we want to engage students emotionally and physically in order to make their learning meaningful and memorable. Because after all, ultimately, what we hope to do is to enable our students to use English in their futures, not just generally to improve their life chances in terms of employment, but to just be more effective, spontaneous speakers. So getting them to engaging them physically and emotionally is hopefully going to help them internalize the language and enable them to use it more spontaneously in the future. And so there's another quote, and this is from Confucius. I hear and I forget. I listen and I remember. I do and I understand. And I think that quite neatly encapsulates one of the key aims of using drama in language education. Aha. Okay. So you may notice the similarity between me and this person in the photograph. First of all, I would like to say that this is evidence that when I was this age, which was 15, photography had been invented, so I'm not that old. I wanted to give you a little bit of background about where my interest in drama came from. So when I was at secondary school here in the UK, in the southeast of England, up until the age of 15, I didn't really have any interest at all in theatre or drama. I didn't take part in any school productions or anything like that. And then one day at school, when I was 15, a friend of mine said that he had seen an advertisement for auditions for the next school production, which was called Kes. And he asked me to go along with him just for a bit of moral support. And I was very, very reluctant at first because I just, as I said, didn't have really any interest in theatre drama at all. But anyway, I went along as his friend and I auditioned, and I ended up getting the principal role, which was a great surprise to me. Because I don't know if you know the play. It's a very English play. It's set in the north of England. It's an old play. I think it's based on a book, I think, which came out in the late 60s. And it's about a young boy who comes from a very impoverished working class background. And he comes from a single parent family, and he befriends a kestrel, as you can see in the photograph. By the way, a live kestrel wasn't used in the live production of the play, in case you're wondering. This was just for promotional purposes. So anyway, so I got the part. It was a massive role, and I had loads and loads of lines to learn. But to cut a long story short, the whole process of putting on the play, working with a small group of peers, and also working with a group of teachers, was incredibly enriching for me. It was an experience I'll never forget, and it's had a lifelong impact on me. And as this talk progresses, some of the things that I learned and I developed during the process of being in that play will come out in the talk. But it was an incredible experience for me. So, you know, as that quote from Graham Greene says, there's always one moment in childhood when the door opens and lets the future in. And for me, this was that one moment in my childhood. So ever since that time, when I acted in the play Kes, I've absolutely been in love with theatre and with the drama. And then if you fast forward a couple of decades to the early 90s, I did my first certificate, my teaching qualification in English language teaching. And I've got some teaching jobs locally in Canterbury, where I am. And after a very short period, I started to realise that a lot of the things that I had been doing in my drama and theatre work could equally be applied to a language classroom. So I started incorporating some of the things I'd learned into the English language classroom, and I realised that students, first of all, really enjoyed them. They got a lot out of them, and there were a lot of social benefits as well, in terms of the way they had to collaborate with each other and produce something. So there were so many benefits, which I'll go into in more detail in a moment. So that's basically a little bit of background information. And then currently I teach at Canterbury Christchurch University, and as often as I possibly can, I incorporate drama and theatre into my teacher training work. So that's a bit of a background information. So let's move on to the next slide. So we've established exactly where the word drama comes from. Now I'm sure, you know, when you as teachers, you see the word drama, things pop into your head, you have particular associations with it. A lot of teachers' associations with drama are, it's putting on some kind of performance in front of a live audience. Now, of course, it certainly can be, and that in itself has many benefits. But drama, of course, in language education doesn't necessarily always lead to a performance. What I've done here on this slide is to give you an overview of some of the main kinds of forms that drama can take in our contexts. So I'll just give you a second to read that slide. I imagine that those terms will be familiar to you. I've got role play and simulation there. A lot of people in the literature, they kind of conflate those two terms. I prefer to kind of separate them. Basically, I differentiate between role play and simulation. Role play is when we get students to play a different character that is not themselves in a particular scene. And a simulation is when we get students to play themselves in a given situation or in a particular scene. So I do like to make that differentiation between those two terms. But otherwise, improvisation, I hope it's probably clear to you. It's basically putting students in a given situation and then getting them to enact it with little or no preparation at all. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we can get students to do that successfully later on. And then otherwise, hopefully everything else is should be clear. Okay, right, so moving on to the next slide. So on the left-hand side here, I've listed all of those things that were on the previous slide. And then on the right-hand side, I've listed the different areas that these activities on the left can develop or can be exploited in the language classroom for our students' benefit. Some of them probably won't be familiar to you, so I'll try not to be too boring and sort of slowly trudge through them. I'll try and do it quite quickly. But it's important, though, that these principles are understood. So the first one is emotion memory. This is something which a Russian actor and director called Konstantin Stanislavski, who some of you may be familiar with. He was an actor trainer. And he likes to exploit his actors' emotion memories. And quite simply put, it meant that when his actors were acting out a scene in a play, and they had to express a particular emotion and find that emotion in themselves. He asked his actors to recall a similar experience which engendered that emotion in them. So, for example, if you're playing a part in a scene that requires you to get angry, and you have to convincingly express that anger, then his actors will, if they find it difficult to act that out, then they will access an emotion or an experience that they actually had in their lives, try and recall the emotion, how they felt, what they said, how they acted and behaved, and then bring that to their performance. And that's something, I'm not saying that we should be getting our students to find their anger all the time, but that's just one example. But exploiting our students' previous experiences and their emotions, I think can be very fruitful and very useful. Okay, next one is posture and movement. That should be clear. Posture, the way we hold ourselves. Kinesic features refer to things like facial expression, gesture, and movement, gesticulation. So basically, these physical non-verbal behaviors that we all do. Ever since we became bipedal many thousands of years ago, we have become incredibly expressive non-verbally. So again, in the language classroom, you might think it's a bit odd to look at body language in a language lesson. Well, of course, if we're thinking about real-world communication, and if we're thinking about kind of helping our students to understand different people that they have to interact with on a daily basis in any language, then being sensitized to other people's kinesic features, I think, is really important. I mean, not in fact, at a kind of a very simple level as well, you could say that, for example, when we watch video material in class, and students, of course, find listening in a foreign language very difficult. Often they find it the most difficult skill. So get them to hone in on the people's body language and get the interpretation of their body language to help them actually understand the video. So it's obviously useful in that sense as well. Diaphragmatic breathing is, again, actors are trained in diaphragmatic breathing. If you do yoga, then you'll be familiar with it. It essentially is breathing deeply, allowing the breath to go all the way down into the stomach area, and actually speaking as much as possible, producing sound using the chest as a resonator, producing sound from the stomach area rather than from the back of the throat. And we'll talk a little bit more about voice later on. I'll go into more detail then. Okay, articulation and prosody. Articulation refers really to the production of individual vowel sounds. Technically speaking, it's the segmentals, so vowels and consonants. And prosody refers to the suprasegmental areas of pronunciation, like intonation patterns, pitch, our pitch of our voice, how high or how low it goes. What else? The pace at which we speak, the volume at which we speak, and of course, very importantly, the tone, our tone of voice, the emotional colouring that we give to our voices when we express thoughts and feelings. And of course, just like body language and raising our students' awareness of aspects of body language, this as well is really important. Prosodic features, and getting, when students are doing the listening exercise, at the very least, you say to them, okay, well, how, listen to the speaker's voice. What is the underlying emotion in the voice? And that will help them better understand the text. That's a kind of a basic sort of language teaching level, but more broadly, obviously for this talk, we're thinking about their general interaction, not just inside the classroom, but outside the classroom as well. And so you're just raising their awareness and tuning their ears into the way people use their voices in different ways. Next thing on the list is status. Now, been to one of my talks before, you'll know that I talk a lot about status because I think it's so important. It's really useful because I think the concept of it is quite easy to grasp, and it can be applied to so many different situations in terms of, you know, the kinds of speaking activities that we give our students to do. Essentially, according to Keith Johnston, who is a prominent improvisation coach, who I think was originally British, but I think he spent his final days in Canada. He did a lot of work with status with his trainee actors. And I use a lot of his ideas in my English language classrooms and teacher training. And status essentially refers to how important or unimportant a person feels. Generally, it could be, or in a given situation. So you might think, for example, a person with a high social status, such as your head teacher at school, you think, okay, he or she is our head teacher. They must have a very high status. They must be brimming with self-confidence, have a very high self-esteem. And this is expressed in the way they speak, the way they stand, the facial expressions they use, the way they move, all of those things, all of those different modes through which we communicate. But status in this context doesn't refer to social status, and that's very important. So, for example, you could feasibly get somebody like a head teacher who has a very low personal status. In other words, even though they may be the head teacher, they actually lack self-confidence. They lack a high self-esteem. It's possible, and that's just an example. The point is, if we teach status to our language students, we can get them to play with it. So each time we get them to act out a given scene, get them to do it a few times, and each time get them to play it in a different status. It's enormous fun, and it actually generates a lot of very interesting discussion afterwards, because it opens students' eyes to real world communication and a better understanding of the people they interact with, and the way people shift their status, because you can shift your status in a single conversation, for different reasons. So if that sounds interesting to you, I really strongly recommend a book called Impro by Keith Johnston. Okay, the next one on the list is tempo rhythm. And this is another term which was used by Stanislavski. And it simply refers to how quickly or slowly a person thinks and processes information and responds. Or it could refer to how they physically move, how they physically carry out everyday actions. So when you're looking around, next time you go for lunch at school, just look around the room. Look at the way people move. Look at the way people eat. Look at the way people express themselves non-verbally. Some people eat really, really quickly. Some people move their head really, really quickly. Other people are just much more laid back. And they just might take a bite and then put the fork down. And then maybe 30 seconds later, pick up another bite, and etc. So people have different kinds of tempo rhythms. And again, it's not something that we would need to spend loads of time on in the classroom, but it's just, again, it's like the other things I've mentioned. It's a bit of a window into people's personality types. And again, we're just raising our students' awareness all through drama. The next one on the list is what Jacques Lecoq, another theatre practitioner, called the 7 levels of tension. This is a fun one to play with. I'll try and keep it short and simple. But essentially, what Jacques Lecoq did is suggest with his trainee actors, when they are developing a character, is to assign them a particular level of tension. The top level of tension, 7, is what's called the jelly person. And you can get students walking around the space. If you've got space in your classroom, You might actually be able to get your students to move around, just moving as though literally they don't have any bones left in their body and they're like jelly. And that would be the extreme, one end of the extreme spectrum of tension. And then it goes down to one, which would be the exact opposite of that. And I don't know if you've ever watched, I know in language classrooms, it's still quite popular to watch Faulty Towers, which was a really popular comedy back in the 70s and 80s. But it doesn't matter if you haven't heard of it. The main character, played by John Cleese, the English actor, is always absolutely as stiff as a board. His face, the muscles in his face, shoulders, chest, legs, every part of his body is absolutely tense because he spends his life as a nervous wreck. And for me, that's actually quite a good character to think of, who has this particular extreme level of tension. So again, it's just like status. It's something you can play with. And in fact, you can do a very quick Google search, 7 levels of tension, Jacques Lecoq, and then you'll get some practical ideas for that online. The next one is hot seating. And this is something some of you may already do in your class. And this is when we invite a student to come out to the front of the class and imagine that they are a particular character. It could be a character from a listening exercise you've done, from a reading text you've done, from a video you've just watched together, or it could be actually part of a mini drama project that you're involved in and you're working with some text. It could be anything. And hot seating is a way of getting students to explore more deeply a character. So the student sits at the front of the class, and the rest of the class have to fire questions at the student at the front in order to find out more about this character's life. And obviously it depends on the level of your students, but you want to encourage them to ask kind of personal questions, things which, for example, weren't mentioned in the reading text or the drama text, the theatre text you've done, or the video or whatever you've used as your source text. But instead, ask questions like, what was your childhood like? Do you have any brothers or sisters? What was the relationship like with your brothers and sisters? That kind of personal question. And it's very challenging. It's great practice. Students have to be spontaneous. The student at the front has to be spontaneous. And of course, ultimately, it encourages students to think more deeply about people, thinking about their backgrounds, their thoughts, their feelings, and that kind of thing. So it's a really, really fun, challenging, and effective activity to do. Really recommend that. Tableau is when we ask our students to create a visual image of an idea. I'm going to, in the second half of the talk, I'm going to look at how we can get students to dramatize things like poetry. Sometimes when I give groups of students a poem, the first thing I ask them to do is, of course, read it, and I have to check their understanding of the poem. And then I ask them to identify particular themes from the poem. So it could be things like murder, or jealousy, or love, or revenge. And the groups have to choose one of the themes for their poem, and they have to create, in their small groups, a still image, physically using their bodies, creating a still image of that theme. And then when they've done that, they perform it to the rest of the class. And then what I like to do actually is when they are posing, they're frozen, I go around the little group and I tap them on the shoulder and I ask them to say one thing in context, in character. Yeah, so that's a nice activity to do as well. Okay, next one is thought tracking. And this is this really encourages students to look below the surface of an utterance of what people say. Challenging to do, certainly, perhaps better suited to high levels. But not necessarily, it depends what text you're using. But I tend to use thought tracking when I use actual piece of drama text. And we're working towards acting it out. And in order for students to find the right emotion at a given moment, encouraging them to simply establish what they think the character is thinking at the moment of speaking those particular words. Because, of course, very often we don't say what we mean. And so it's a nice activity to get students to think along those lines. Okay, nearly there. Blocking and accepting. Again, this largely comes from the work of Keith Johnston, the improvisation coach. And we're going to talk about improvisation skills a little bit later on, because of course, when we get students to improvise, we need to equip them with skills in order for them to be able to do it well. We don't want our students, excuse me, to fall on their faces and not make a good job of it. We want to increase their confidence. We want them to do well. And so things like playing with status and playing with blocking and accepting can be very useful. And blocking is during an improvisation when somebody, one of the people in the interaction blocks by, for example, saying something completely unrelated to the scene. That sometimes happens when I've done it with students. Or it might be when a student disagrees with something the other person has said. So a block is anything that makes it difficult for the improvisation to move forwards. Now, obviously in drama, we want a certain amount of blocking. Otherwise, there's no conflict. We've got to have a bit of conflict. But in terms of providing our students with extended speaking practice and listening practice as well, because when we get them to interact with each other, we want them to really listen to each other as well. So encouraging them to accept what the other person says rather than block. Now, in my experience of doing improvisation with my students, I find that at the beginning, they block a lot. And I think the conclusion I've come to is that the reason they do this is because it gives them control of the situation. Maybe they're nervous. So if they have control of the situation, they know where it's going. Whereas if they're improvising with somebody and they just say, oh yeah, I see what you mean, well, that's interesting. Oh yeah, I agree with that. Then they don't know really what the other person is going to say, which of course mirrors real world communication. And so what it does is it hopefully over time develops their confidence and makes them more creative speakers, and it allows them more extended speaking practice. So that's a nice thing to play with as well. And then trust exercises, second to last point there. These are things, you can see the picture on my slide. This is quite an extreme trust exercise. So it's basically any exercise, normally non-verbal, but sometimes they can be verbal. Exercises, short exercises that build trust between students. And again, you really, for a lot of trust exercises, you need quite a bit of space in your classroom, or even better, if you can take your students to a hall or something like that, if you've got that facility in your school. And it involves, most of the time, students working in pairs. One of them has their eyes closed, and the other has to lead them around the room. And that's great for developing their spatial awareness. But of course, mostly it's aimed at developing trust between the two participants. A nice activity I like to do is what I call blind car. So one person leads their partner with their eyes closed around the space, just using their finger in their back. And you've just got your finger in their back, and they move forward. If you take your finger off, they have to stop. If you touch them on the right shoulder, they turn right. Touch the left shoulder, they turn left. And you basically have to lead your partner around the room. and that's a nice exercise to do. But again, just needs to be a couple of minutes at the beginning of the lesson. And then the last point, we got to the last point at last, is character resume. And this is nice and simple. It's basically, again, it could be working from a script if you're working on a piece of text with students that are going to dramatize the text, or it could be thinking about a character from a video, a reading text, or a listening text. And it's a more of a written version of hot seating. So again, it's through guided questions. I'll give you some examples later, but it's through guided questions, getting students to flesh out a character, looking at a character's life in totality. So not just, if you watch the video, it's not just the few minutes that they've seen them on screen, but it's actually, in theatre, we call it their pre-curtain history. So you're looking at their whole life, really, and the influences that other people have on their lives, and all kinds of experiences that they may have had. So that's kind of a written version of hot seating. Okay, so that was a bit of a marathon, but I've gone through those. Now I'm going to move on to the next slide. Just give you a few seconds to read that slide. So I think to kind of summarize this slide and sort of encapsulates, I think, everything I've said so far, is that we're looking at communication holistically, and we are tapping into our learners' thoughts, feelings, knowledge, and experiences, and not just talking about it, of course, but with drama, we're getting students to do it and talk about it afterwards. So it's kind of providing students with a sort of a vicarious experience inside the classroom. And it makes the whole learning process more meaningful for them. So I don't know about you, but I spent most of my school years asking myself why we were studying certain things at school. So hopefully using a drama approach in language teaching can clearly provide that for students. Okay. And there's just a little quote from me. I'll just give you a few seconds to read that. So you can see I've included in that quote a natural desire to develop meaningful relationships. And I think if teachers work at that inside the classroom, you're building students' social skills simultaneously with developing their linguistic and their communicative skills. So as it says there, drama can develop personal, social, communicative, and linguistic skills. There, that's all we need, drama, that's it. Okay, and then very quickly, when to use drama. Okay, again, I won't read the slide out because I can probably order my voice at the moment. Transition activities, I simply mean going from one activity to the next. So there might be a kind of a short bridging activity that you might do. And I hope you liked my reference to Shakespeare there. To be or not to be. To be or not to be performed, that is. Okay. So, still defining some terms. So I said earlier how important developing our students' listening skills is during spoken interaction. And we talk in active listening, really, I think, is a concept that comes from counselling. And it includes things like back channeling, which is when we visibly and audibly show the other person that we're listening and interested in what they're saying. Summarizing, when we verbally summarize what the person has just said, or paraphrasing, saying what the other person has just said using slightly different language. asking questions about what someone has just said, and suspending judgment, and thereby engendering empathy, hopefully. And I mean, these are concepts that we can actually bring up with our students and teach them about it. And I think the great thing, one of the things I think I said on the previous slide, was that using drama and looking at these different aspects of interaction, we can teach a lot of content as well. And in my experience, students have found this interesting and enlightening. And then on the right hand side on this slide, I've listed some so-called faulty listening behaviours. And I've got a slide in a moment which explains what they are. So I won't go into those. I'm just looking at the clock and I can see that time is running away with me. But I'll explain in a moment how I go through these with students. So I think this is the final, yeah, okay. So just give you a second, because we're still defining our terms. Let's try and establish exactly what we mean by complete empathy. Okay, so you can see the first dimension is so-called cognitive, and it's imagining what is going on in the minds of other people. The second dimension is affective. So trying to understand the other person's feelings. And then the final is empathic. So it's an emotional response of compassion that leads us to care about the other person's welfare. Right? I mean, in our own minds as teachers, if we are going to look at these different areas inside the classroom, then we obviously need to have a solid understanding of what these terms mean. Okay, so kinesics and parallel back up. I think I've already mentioned, I mentioned these right at the beginning, so I don't need to go into these in any more detail, but they should be self-explanatory anyway. Just those funny little terms there, if you're not familiar with them. Proxemics is the study of physical distance that we keep with other people, comes from proximity. And again, in terms of rapport, relationships that we have with others, and also culture as well, sometimes it can be culture specific. We manage that physical space in different ways with different people, depending on the relationship that we have with them. Haptics refers to the use of physical touch, and again, depending on the relationship that we have with the other person, there might be no physical touching at all, or there might be some, other kind of touching on the shoulder or whatever. Yeah, so that's what those two terms mean. So we're still defining our terms, and again, I mean, this is a kind of language that I actually teach students when I teach them drama, and they're really, really willing to learn some of this technical language. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to attempt to put theory to practice, but as Alan said at the beginning, I'm going to kind of pause here. And if anyone has any questions, Alan's going to come back in, I think, and maybe read out some questions.
Yes, certainly. We've got a few questions, not a huge number, but some very good ones. You said a few moments ago that proxemics might be, or probably is, affected by cultural norms.
Yeah.
And there's a question here about status, whether status is culturally determined or more of a personal trait.
Well, I think that's a really good question. And I would probably answer that by saying it's both, which is a bit of a cop-out. But no, no, I think it's it can be culture specific, and you know, there are some cultures in the world which are, for example, honorific cultures, and publicly showing deference and showing respect and showing a lower status to older people or people at a higher level than you within a company that you work for or whatever is quite the norm. So it can be culture specific. So if it's a high context culture, for example, some countries in Asia, then of course it is culture specific. But then you've got low context cultures, like large parts of the US, I suppose, and to an extent the UK, perhaps some of Europe. Difficult to generalize, but you might say though that we are low context cultures in the sense that publicly showing the status differentials between yourself and people who are older than you or at a higher grade than you wherever you work is perhaps not quite so obvious, and that's reflected in our behavior and the kind of language we use. I've done a lot of teacher training with Swedish teacher trainees, and they tell me that it's actually really common. For example, some of them mentioned to me that they, before they went into teaching. Now, sorry, this wasn't a teacher. It was a teacher. Before they went into teaching, they worked for a big corporation, and it was really common for the chief executive officer to email everybody beginning with "Hi everyone." I mean, that's like an example of a relatively low status thing to do. Say "Hi everyone," especially coming from a chief executive officer. And then apparently this CEO would end her emails "Love from," and then whatever her name was. And I think actually the student said she sometimes puts a kiss at the end of her emails, which is quite extreme. But that's an example where it is quite culture specific. But then, of course, within these different cultures, people do have a personal status, and our status changes according to where we are and who we're speaking to and what the interaction is about, what we want from a particular situation. So, for example, the example I like to give my students is, when I'm at work and I'm speaking to my line manager, I might pitch my status a little bit lower than hers. And there's a reason why I do that. But whenever I speak to my 18-year-old daughter, my status goes even lower because that's my teenage daughter. But then when I'm lecturing in class, I would need to increase my status a little bit in order for my students to hopefully perceive me as being credible and knowledgeable. So I would increase my status in that particular context. So,
and of course, sorry.
Yeah, go on.
As I think Keith Johnston points out, status can fluctuate in the course of a single action. You can play with it in very interesting ways.
Absolutely. And I think we do that. And, in terms of developing our students' social skills, raising their awareness of just the way, imagine Alan, you and I were having a coffee somewhere, and I said, "Oh, Alan, how's your week been?" So I've asked you that question. I've shown you interest. I've shown interest in you, and I've asked you a question, and that very act very slightly lowers my status beneath yours. Not greatly, just a little bit, because I'm saying I'm interested in you. So I'm lowering my status a little bit in a positive way. And then you tell me, and then you being the sociable person that you are, you say, "So what about you, Mark? How's your week been?" And then I would explain how my week's been. And so my status would go up a little bit and yours would come down a little bit. And so Keith Johnston calls it a kind of a seesaw effect. And if you can observe that in communication, you realize that is often what makes communication successful. So getting students to play with this idea in extended speaking activities can be great fun and, of course, eye-opening. because they don't realize often what's going on. You just ask your students, do you ever have conversations which are really difficult? Are there people you sometimes speak to and it's actually really difficult to keep the conversation going for more than 30 seconds? They say, oh God, yeah, I can think of a few people, yeah. Okay, so why? Why do you think that is? And then ask them to think about people with which they have conversations that are effortless. And say, okay, so why is it so easy to speak to that person? And then, these things sort of become, are revealed. And then you can, introduce them to the idea of status and the way you can play with it for these kinds of purposes. So, yeah. Does that answer the question? Kind of.
Absolutely.
I hope so.
There's a question here about storytelling. Would you say that drama is, or how similar would you say drama is to storytelling? Are they related? Are they
Okay.
on a continuum?
Definitely related. Related. I mean, I would certainly say storytelling is a kind of a performance art. And all of the things that I've mentioned earlier about non-verbal communication and the use of the voice and gesture, movement, and all those kinds of things come into storytelling. Obviously, it depends on what kind of storytelling you're talking about. If you are getting students, for example, to recall using their emotion memory and get them to recall a disastrous holiday they had, and you want them to relate that story to a partner, that's storytelling. And you might want to encourage them to be as expressive as possible with all these different modes of communication. If you're talking about the traditional way of storytelling, i.e., like reading from a book to your class or getting a student to read a story out, then really the same thing applies. Voice is really important. Movement, characterization is really important. So I would say storytelling is definitely an important aspect of drama, and getting students to do it as well. On my first slide, I talked about giving presentations, only because more and more these days, our students are expected to give presentations to the rest of the class, and it's a really important skill because people are often asked to do it in the workplace. So it's good training for our students. And so the reason I included it here is because, again, just like storytelling, you're using movement, you need energy, you need to be expressive with your voice and with your face. And it's raising students' awareness of all these things and getting them to practice it inside the classroom, which should be a relatively safe place to do it.
And one more question, which I suspect answers itself.
Good. My favourite
one. Can we say that using drama in language teaching helps students deal with real life situations and finding solutions when they've been exposed to improvising such challenges?
Well, I think that's another brilliant question, and I certainly would say immediately that using drama in the context of this talk is by no means aiming to be any kind of therapy or solution finding or dealing with students' real personal traumas or anything like that. So I'm certainly not talking about using drama as any kind of real therapy at all, but really just using drama as a kind of a springboard for discussion. So it's getting students physically and emotionally involved, and it is providing them with a vicarious experience, i.e., they're pretending. We're in the classroom and we're imagining different situations and different relationships, different characters. But at the heart of drama is pretending, this notion of pretending, and that must never be forgotten.
So
yeah,
there might be implications from the experience, but it's not the.
That is what, sorry?
Is it I say the experience of improvising, working out situations in the classroom might have implications for real life situations, but it's not in itself therapeutic.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. You know, after all, we are all here. We are language teachers or language teacher educators. We're not counselors. We're not therapists. Even though, of course, quite often we are called upon to help students with personal problems. That's really not what our job is. But inside the classroom, with groups of students, we're language teachers.
Yeah.
But what we're trying to do by using a drama approach is to raise awareness, to pretend, to try and bridge the gap between the kind of language work that's traditionally done with the kind of language and communication that they will perhaps be confronted with outside of the classroom. So it's getting them to practice living in English in hopefully the safe confines of the classroom. And that's, for me, that's where it ends.
Thanks for that clarification, Mark.
No
I'll
problem.
let you get back to the
Okay.
second half of your talk.
Okay, I can see there are some more questions, which is great, but we will have time towards the end. So, of course, hang on a minute. There we go. So, right, before I show that, so bearing in mind that this is an online talk, it means that I have to be quite descriptive and verbose when explaining the practical application of drama, because obviously, in the ideal situation, we would all be in a nice, big, spacious room, and I'll be getting you to do this stuff physically with each other. So do bear with me while I go through some of this practical application, but I hope it won't be too bad. So this refers back, you don't have to read, please don't read this whole slide. There's too much language there. I've committed the worst PowerPoint sin there is by having a cluttered slide. But this is just something that I use with my students, and they are brief descriptions of those 40 listening behaviors that I mentioned earlier. So there's pseudo listening, selective listening, defensive listening, ambushing, insulated listening, insensitive listening, and stage hoggers. Hopefully this PowerPoint presentation will be available to you, so you can refer back to it. But I just want to explain how I use this with students. Obviously, it depends on the level. If they're lower level, then of course I will simplify the language here. But what I do is I get them to stand in a circle, maybe no more than 10 in each circle. Obviously, it depends how many people are in your class. And I will demonstrate. So right hand, your finger is pointed up, and your left hand is on your partner's finger, like that. So my partner here, on their right hand, they will point their finger there. My hand will be on top of it. This side, my finger's pointed up, and this partner, their left hand will be on top of my finger like that. I hope that's clear. Try and visualize it. And then what I do is I fairly slowly read through these descriptions of 40 listening behaviors. And each time they hear a cognate of the word listen, so it could be listen, listening, listened, listener, anything like that, then they have to grab the person's finger. Or if their partner is trying to grab their finger, they have to try and escape or avoid their finger being caught by their partner. It's great fun. It's really noisy, loads of laughter, which is what you want. And then at the end of it, you say, okay, so let's summarize then the content of that text. And of course, nobody can remember a single word that I read out. And that, of course, is because all they were doing is that they were selective listening. They were just listening out for the word listen, listened, listening or listener or whatever, and didn't take in any of the content at all. And then you say, oh, okay, yeah, okay. So selective listening, that's something we often do. And then you might hand out the text, they read it, and then you talk about it. And again, it's just a a case of raising their awareness of these different kinds of faulty listening behaviors that we all are guilty of. And, you know, thinking again about emotion memory, to follow it up, just say to them, so can you think of a time when you were a selective listener or a defensive listener or a pseudo listener? Or can you think of anyone you know who does this? Is there anyone you know who is a conversational narcissist? Someone who always turns the topic of conversation onto themselves. You know, you want to tell someone that you've just come back from a wonderful holiday. Oh, I've just had a brilliant holiday. I've just spent the last 2 weeks in Madrid. And then the other person says, Madrid? Oh, I've been to Madrid several times. And then they spend the next 5 minutes telling you all about their experiences of being in Madrid. We all know people like that. So that's the purpose of that activity. But the drama aspect is, you know, that fun physical exercise that leads into the content of the lesson. Now, in terms of prosody and connected speech, again, this is a drama activity which I love doing. And in fact, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to be brave and I'm going to ask you, I can't see anybody, but I would like you to do this with me. So if you're sitting at a computer or a laptop or whatever, I want you to beat out a rhythm. So the rhythm is this: 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You get your students in unison doing this in class. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you write up on the whiteboard, you, me, him, her. And then you do that with students and say, you, me, him, her. You, me, him, her. And then on the whiteboard, you add the word and between each word. The same rhythm, the same pace, but you've got more words. You and me and him and her. You and me and him and her. And then you continue adding more and more words until you end up with you and then a me and then a him and then a her. You and then a me and then a him and then a her. You and then a me and then a him and then a her. And so again, it's a nice, you know, get students doing it standing up. It's a nice physical activity, and it's a great way of illustrating how connected speech works, how weak forms work, how elision works, how intrusive sounds work. So you've got you and me, you've got the work, intrusive work, you and me, and you've got and becoming you and me, you and then a me. All interesting things like that, which of course helps students with their listening skills, but also, you know, if they're confident speakers of English, it makes their English sound more fluent as well. So it's a nice physical drama activity that highlights different features of connected speech. Good fun. Another exercise I like to do, I call it I and Love and You. And again, I know all of your microphones are muted, because it'd be great fun to get a couple of you to try this, but I have to describe it. So you ask 2 students to come out to the front, and you say to them, okay, I want you to imagine that you are a couple. Obviously, it depends on the age of your students. It's got to be appropriate. It could be your brother and sister, or your mother and father, or father and son, or whatever. And you ask them to improvise a really, really terrible argument. But the only words they can use are I and love and you. So again, there's very minimal language. We are just getting students to focus on the importance of prosody, the way we modulate our voices, the pitch, the pace, the volume, and the tone. And so ultimately, you want students to have a conversation like this. Imagine I'm improvising with somebody. Love. Love, I. Love you, I. Love you, etc. So you're not getting students to create sentences. They're just using those individual words in any order to communicate with the other person. It's just fun if you use the words I and love and you, because they're having an argument and they're using kind of contradictory language. So yeah, but then the next one there, so there's a very common children's nursery rhyme. And the way I like to use these is you can put this nursery rhyme on the board or any other nursery rhyme, and students work in pairs, and one student has to conduct their partner. And the way you conduct your partner should reflect the way the other person speaks the nursery rhyme. So, for example, if I'm the conductor and I begin with this gesture, then my partner has to speak like this: the Grand Old Duke of York. And then for the next line, I might go like this: he had 10,000 men. And that you can use your facial expression, your whole body, your arms to express yourself, for the conductor to express him or herself non-verbally, and that has to be reflected in the way the other person speaks. So again, very minimal text. It's linguistically, it's not challenging, but it does specifically focus on different aspects of voice, which are really, really important in effective communication. And then taking it kind of one step further, you can get students to work with so-called adjacency pairs. And this is great fun. And I'm going to ask you just in 1 minute to write some ideas in the chat, not Q&A, but in the chat. So these are adjacency pairs. You put students in pairs and you say, these are the only words, or these are the only lines you can use. Give you 1 minute, think of a scenario where you would use these adjacency pairs. So the first one is, help me, I can't. And the second one is, I'm sorry, I can't believe it. So just in 1 minute in the chat, can you think of a context for just one of those? You don't have to do both of them, just think of one of them. I'll check in the chat, see what we've got. I'll give you an example. For help me, I can't. It could be a child doing her homework and the parent cooking. And the child says, help me. And the parent says, I can't. Help me. I can't. Help me. I can't. Etc. The scene only has to last for 10, 20 seconds, something like that. But again, it's minimal language, but it's getting students to play with the modulation of their voices. So we've got, what have we got? Hungry, okay. Someone's wife is drowning in a river. Okay, it's Friday afternoon. Let's keep it light. Nothing too tragic. Someone's stuck in a hole. Very nice. We'll just wait for a couple more, see what we get. Student doing an exam. That's nice. That's very good. Learning to ride a bike. I like that one. Someone is carrying heavy bags. No, okay, you've got, so just in a matter of seconds, you can think of half a dozen or more different scenarios. And again, you know, it's good fun because students are physicalizing the scene and using their voices expressively. Lovely. Okay. We'll move on to the next one. And then to take it even a step further, I think, as I mentioned earlier, you can actually get students to dramatize a piece of poetry. And I will give you 30 seconds to read this poem because I love this poem and it's really suitable for a student dramatization. Okay, hopefully you've managed to read all of it or most of it. So first thing, as I mentioned earlier, you could get students to do a tableau. In other words, a group visualization of one of the themes. And I would say one of the themes is fear in this poem. And then, you know, you get them in small groups. You've done some vocal warm-up. You've done some of the exercises that I've already mentioned, quick exercises. 4 or 5 minutes maximum, and then you give them a piece of poetry and maybe give them something like 15 minutes to prepare a dramatization of it. So they actually have to act it out. I normally tell students that they don't have to learn it, but they do have to act it out. And if it's done in small groups of 4 or 5 students, it's important to say to students that they equally share out the roles and the lines in the poem so that everybody is involved. And that's a very creative thing to do. Again, it's not students having to produce their own language, it's getting them to work with language, with a particular focus on expressiveness, vocal expressiveness, and physical expressiveness. Okay, I'm just looking at the time. Okay, so activities for exploring status. So a nice initial activity is to use a pack of playing cards like these and explain to students that if your status is ace, that is extremely high. If you are an ace, then you are full of self-confidence, full of self-esteem, so much so that you are arrogant. And in fact, 99.9% of the population don't want anything to do with you. So it's very, very extreme. At the other end of the scale, if you have a status of 2, you're the exact opposite. You have no self-confidence, no self-esteem whatsoever. And you hate social gatherings. You get highly anxious in any kind of interaction with other people. And again, it's very, very extreme. So once you have explained and elicited examples from students exactly what status means in this context, so not social status, but personal status, then you might ask for a volunteer student and you secretly give them a playing card, for example, a 5, and you say, what I'd like you to do is go outside the room, then come in, walk up to the chair, and simply say, good morning, everybody. My name is Peter, or whatever. But they have to do it in their status. And then they do it, and the rest of the class has to guess what their status card was. So obviously from 2 to ace, that's quite a range there. So for example, playing a 5, you might say, well, is that high or low? It's relatively low, but not really low. Possibly someone who doesn't get too nervous in social situations, but perhaps is lacking a little bit in self-confidence. Whatever. I mean, to an extent, it is subjective. But what's great is when I do this work with students, is that a lot of really interesting discussion is generated when we start thinking about people we know, when we start thinking about ourselves, and start thinking about our behaviors towards other people. So it's quite insightful in that sense. And then you might, after that, you might get a few students to do it with different statuses, and then you might get a group of students up at the front who have to imagine that they are at a party. And you give each person a status card that only they can see. They look at it, they put it in their pocket, you start the improvisation, which only lasts for maybe a minute, and you ask them to act it out, with the rest of the class watching carefully how they speak, how they interact, how they behave, how they move, their facial expressions, the pitch of their voices, the proxemics, the distance they keep between themselves and other people, all of those kinds of things we've already discussed. And then they try and put them in line, lowest status to highest status. And again, it's great fun, and it's a nice, simple, understandable activity for students to do. And it's very visual, and again, it generates, as I said, a lot of discussion. And then I put interview there as the final bullet point, and that's getting students to carry out interviews, setting up improvisations where they have, one of them is obviously the interviewer, the other one is the interviewee, And again, just get them to do the short interviews, playing different statuses and just seeing what the effect is. So, for example, having the interviewee with a higher status than the interviewer, and look at that. And then look at maybe interviewee and interviewer with a very high status. What would happen then? There would be conflict and there would be no resolution. If you had one of them with a really, well, for example, if you had one with a very low status and the other one with a medium status, and then look at how that would manifest itself in the improvisation. So you get all of those different variations. And you're getting, you're getting students to pretend to be these different statuses. So it's a window into this whole notion of how we adjust our behavior. So in terms of developing empathy, it's quite useful. And again, bearing in mind we're pretending in a safe environment, and it's enormous fun. Okay, and then I'll just give you a second to read up. I'm just looking at the clock and running out of time, but never mind. So this is the idea here is using visual prompts to think about characterization. And again, in terms of developing empathy, don't just get students to describe the pictures physically, but get them to try and enter the minds of the people in the pictures, what their experiences are, what their relationships are, what they're thinking about, what they're feeling. And then I think this is this is the final one. Oh, I'm kind of almost dead on time. And so perhaps the most challenging improvisation task you could do is actually to get students in small groups develop a scene. And I call it a structured improvisation in the sense that I give them question prompts. And these are the question prompts I give them. So I'll just give you a few seconds to read those. So what students have to do is ideally working in groups of maybe five students per group. They have to sit round in their groups, discuss these questions in turn. They are not allowed to write any dialogue, but what they do obviously need to establish is where they are, what is happening, what people are talking about, how the story progresses, how it ends, what the relationship is between the different characters in the scene, all that kind of thing. And then when they had a little bit of time, 15, 20 minutes is probably enough, maybe a bit longer, they actually have to act out their scenes to the rest of the class. And of course, because these question prompts are very generic, every group has a completely different scene. And when they act out the scenes, of course, they are completely improvised. And they only need to last maybe 3 or 4 minutes maximum. That's quite a long time to be improvising for. So yeah. Okay. So that's the final practical activity. So it was a little bit laborious going through those. I know it's much better if we were in a workshop room doing it ourselves. But I hope that has given you some idea of why and how a drama approach can really effectively address our students' social, emotional, physical, linguistic, communicative needs. And hopefully, well, speaking from experience, can provide students with meaningful and memorable experiences inside the classroom. Okay, so I'll stop there. I think it's 5:29. So are there any more questions, Alan?
Yes, if we can squeeze in a couple of final questions. I've actually taken screenshots of the remaining questions, which I'll send to you, and perhaps you might want to let me have some considered comments, because some of them are quite large questions. Some of them also imply the answers. Anyway, let me just ask you this, very specific about sources or resources. If you could recommend anything on the use of voice, on modulating your voice, using different tones. Have you come across any practical books or online resources that would meet that interest?
Well, so I've just put my two books up on the screen. Can you see that? Yeah. So in these two books, there are many practical exercises that you can do with students, which specifically develop vocal range, and also voice maintenance. So there are a lot of voice activities there, which are very useful for teachers in terms of maintaining their voice, because of course our voices are incredibly important. But thinking about the teacher's voice, now if I can just turn around and look at my shelf.
Alan Maley's book.
Alan Maley's book is the one I was going to mention.
Called The Teacher's Voice.
Exactly. So that's certainly one. Alan Maley's The Teacher's Voice. I mean, there's a voice coach called Cicely Berry. Now she's a very prominent voice coach, and she has a couple of publications out. So Cicely Berry, Berry. I'm just seeing if I'm sure I've got one of them on my shelf. But that's certainly one that I would recommend. I can't find it on my shelf at the moment.
Okay, I've put those into the chat.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so there's a couple to be getting on with. But as I say, though, there are plenty in my two books there as well, which you might like to consider.
One final question that relates to a current interest in translanguaging and the use of mother tongue in the classrooms. The question is, should drama in an EFL class be only in English, or can we use it in can we incorporate mother tongue as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think hopefully gone are the days where people in our industry say we should never use the L1 inside the English language classroom. I mean, I know there are still some people who say that should be the case, but no. I mean, with everything that I've spoken about this afternoon, we're looking at people holistically. We are basically teaching in a very humanistic way. So we're looking at all different ways that we communicate with others, and also the way we connect with others, and the way we develop rapport with others and empathy. And sometimes sometimes it's difficult to express in your L1, let alone an L2. But if you can't express it in the L2, then of course I would say to teachers, allow your students to express what they're thinking in their L1, and then just help them translate it into English.
Yeah.
That's it. Good answer.
Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Lots of very positive comments in the chat. Perhaps the one that sums up the reaction best is a single word, which was wow.
Oh, good.
Which is very nice.
Oh, that's nice. I'm just reading the comments now. Thank you. Thanks very much, everybody. I do obviously hope you found that really useful. Yeah, there you go.
thanks again. And just to remind you, everyone, the video recording will be, or a link to the video recording will be made available within the next few days. I think Mark will also be able to let us have a copy of his PowerPoint. I hope so,
Perfect.
because it was quite challenging for speed reading at times.
Sorry.
No, no, not at all. I think people had time to skim read, but
Okay.
you know, would really like to revisit some of those ideas.
Yeah. And actually, I'm seriously, I mean this genuinely. If anyone's got any questions they want to email me, there's my email address. I'm really happy to answer emails.
That's great. And that reminds me too, as many of you know, um, as part of this series of webinars, you are invited to submit a short assignment, which will be some kind of teaching plan. It could be a lesson plan, a plan for a series of lessons, a plan for an activity or a set of activities, which it's the idea is that you submit one assignment for related to any of the topics in any of the webinars. So not an assignment for each webinar, but if this one has particularly interested you and sparked off ideas for things that you can do in your, put it into an assignment, which we'll pass on to Mark. The easiest way for you to do that is to send it to me at this email address, and I'll pass it on to Mark. So thank you once again, Mark. That was a really fascinating session. Lots of very doable, practical ideas. I think if teachers started at 4 o'clock thinking, well, I could never do it. I mean, it's very interesting, but I could never do it. I think you demonstrated that all of these activities are within the reach of every teacher, and are really an extension of the work that we do anyway. Oh, sorry, I just noticed that my email, there was a typo, so I'm going to put it in again. Okay, thanks again, everyone, and see you in January.
Goodbye, everybody. Have a good weekend. All right, Alice, shall I just leave, Alan?